I'm going to tell you something that I wish someone had whispered to me when I was in my 70s, before I spent so many long nights staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was slowly losing the life I loved. If you are waking up two, three, or even four times every night just to walk to the bathroom, please don't decide too quickly that this is simply the price of getting older. Many older people believe the bladder is always the only thing to blame, and for years I believed that too. But after living for more than 90 years, meeting people from different countries, and watching friends grow old in very different ways, I began to notice a pattern that nobody had ever explained to me in plain words. The surprising part is that the answer may have less to do with what happens during the night than with what quietly happens all day long. I hope you'll stay with me, because the little discovery that changed how I looked at my own body also changed how I looked at growing older itself. When I was younger, I thought a good night's sleep was something that either stayed with you forever or disappeared without warning. I never imagined that restless nights could slowly steal so much from my mornings. I remember waking up tired, forgetting little things I had known for years, feeling less patient with people I loved, and wondering if my independence was beginning to slip away, one quiet night at a time. It frightened me more than I liked to admit. I wasn't afraid of wrinkles or gray hair. I was afraid of becoming someone who needed help for every little thing. Throughout my life, I noticed that many people around my age accepted these changes without asking why. They would shrug their shoulders and say, "This is what happens after 65." Yet every now and then, I would meet someone in their 90s who slept peacefully, walked with confidence, smiled easily, and still seemed full of gentle energy. I often wondered what quiet habit separated them from everyone else. Was it something they ate? Was it the way they moved? Or was the real answer hiding somewhere nobody thought to look? It took me many years to understand that the story was much bigger than I had imagined, and what finally opened my eyes surprised me more than anything else I had learned during my very long life. When I was 74, I thought I had already learned every lesson my body wanted to teach me. I had raised my children, buried my dear husband, welcomed grandchildren into the world, and spent enough years watching life change to believe that very little could still surprise me. Then, little by little, my nights began to change. At first, I woke only once to use the bathroom. I told myself it was nothing. A few months later, it became twice, then sometimes three times before sunrise. I tried drinking less water in the evening. Then I blamed my age, and eventually I simply accepted that I would always wake up exhausted. The hardest part was not the walk to the bathroom. It was waking the next morning with a foggy mind and wondering why even simple conversations felt more tiring than they used to. I began forgetting where I had placed my glasses, missing little appointments, and feeling anxious over things that had never worried me before. I wondered if this was how independence quietly disappeared, not all at once, but one restless night after another. During those years, I met many wonderful people. Some were neighbors, some were old friends, and others I met while visiting my daughter, who loved traveling and often invited me to join her. I remember an elderly woman from a small village near the coast who laughed when I apologized for looking tired. She gently asked me whether my legs felt heavy by evening. That question stayed with me because nobody had ever asked it before. A few months later, another gentleman I met during a community gathering mentioned that his shoes always felt tighter at night than in the morning, yet he rarely woke to use the bathroom. Those conversations made me curious. Throughout my life, I noticed that older people often shared little observations that never appeared in magazines or television programs. They spoke about swollen ankles after long days, about how a short walk after dinner seemed to make them feel lighter, or how sleeping with calmer thoughts somehow helped the whole night unfold differently. None of them claimed to have secret answers. They simply paid close attention to their own lives. Slowly, I realized that perhaps I had been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of wondering only what my bladder was doing while I slept, maybe I needed to understand what my whole body had been doing, from morning until bedtime. That quiet thought became the beginning of a journey that changed far more than my nights. And what I discovered next was something I wish every older person could hear before giving up hope. One day, I finally understood that I had been paying attention to the wrong part of the story. I had spent years wondering why my bladder kept waking me, but I had almost never stopped to think about what happened inside my body before I even went to bed. A kind nurse once told me that our bodies are always trying to keep balance, even when they grow older. That simple sentence stayed with me for years. Later, after reading, listening, and asking careful questions during my regular checkups, I learned that researchers continue studying how fluid moves through the body as we age. Some older adults notice that their ankles become puffy by evening after many hours of sitting or standing. I smiled when I heard that because I had noticed the very same thing without ever thinking it could matter. My shoes often felt tighter at sunset than they had that morning, and I assumed that was simply another birthday gift from old age. Looking back now, I believe my body had been quietly giving me clues all along. As the years passed, I met older people who seemed to age with remarkable grace. They were not perfect. They had wrinkles, sore joints, and slower steps, just like the rest of us. Yet many of them slept more peacefully and greeted each morning with surprising energy. I often asked them gentle questions instead of searching for magical secrets. One lovely woman from a gardening club told me she always spent a little time with her feet resting higher than her heart before bedtime because it helped her feel lighter. Another gentleman who had worked as a fisherman said he avoided very salty evening meals because they left him feeling swollen the next day. Neither of them claimed these habits would solve everyone's problems. They simply shared what had helped them over many years, and their calm confidence made me curious. The more stories I collected, the more I realized that healthy aging rarely depended on one dramatic change. It seemed to grow from many small habits working together with patience. Some studies suggest that changes in circulation and the way the body handles fluids may play a role in nighttime bathroom visits for certain older adults, although every person is different and many causes are possible. That thought gave me comfort instead of fear, because it reminded me that my body was not trying to betray me. Perhaps it was only asking me to listen more carefully. But there was one simple evening habit that surprised me more than anything else. And when I finally made it part of my own routine, I began noticing changes I never expected. The more I listened to older people, the more I realized how easy it is to focus on the wrong problem. I cannot count how many times I heard someone say, "My bladder is getting old," and then end the conversation there. I used to say the very same thing. Looking back, I don't blame any of us. When we wake several times each night, we naturally think about the last thing that happened before we got out of bed. But I slowly began wondering whether that was only the final chapter of a much longer story. During one of my regular appointments, I asked questions instead of rushing home with another suggestion to try. The conversation reminded me that our bodies are wonderfully connected. Researchers continue studying how changes in circulation, hormone signals, the kidneys, and everyday habits may all influence nighttime urination in older adults. That made far more sense to me than believing a single organ was responsible for everything. Throughout my life, I noticed that many friends develop swollen ankles by evening, especially after long hours sitting in a favorite chair or standing in the kitchen. By morning, those swollen ankles often looked much better. I began asking myself a simple question that nobody had ever explained clearly. Where did that extra fluid go during the night? The answer I heard was surprisingly gentle. As some older adults lie down, fluid that collected in the lower legs during the day may gradually return to the bloodstream. The heart notices the change, The kidneys respond by filtering more fluid, and that may contribute to more urine being produced while a person is sleeping. Many people have never heard this possibility discussed in simple language, yet it helped me look at my own evenings very differently. I also started paying attention to little everyday habits that seemed too ordinary to matter. Salty dinners, long afternoons without moving very much, and sitting with my feet on the floor for hours all seemed to leave my legs feeling heavier. On the other hand, days filled with gentle walks, lighter evening meals, and quiet moments of movement often felt different before bedtime. I cannot say those habits explain every person's experience, because they certainly do not. There are many possible causes of frequent nighttime urination, and anyone with new or worsening symptoms should speak with a healthcare professional. Still, my own observations gave me hope because they suggested that my body was sending understandable signals instead of simply wearing out. And once I began thinking that way, I became eager to experiment with a few simple daily routines that eventually transformed not only my nights, but also the way I greeted each new morning. As the years passed, I stopped searching for one magical answer because life had already taught me that real change usually arrives quietly. I began noticing that the older people who remained active into their 90s shared something much deeper than a particular diet or exercise routine. They paid attention to small daily habits that hardly seemed important on their own, yet together they created a life that felt lighter, calmer, and more balanced. One gentleman I met at a community library told me he never hurried through the morning. Before breakfast, he would slowly rise onto his toes and gently lower his heels again several times while holding the kitchen counter. He smiled and said it helped his legs feel awake before the day even began. I remember thinking how simple that sounded, yet he walked with remarkable confidence for a man well into his 90s. Another dear friend always prepared her evening meal with fresh herbs instead of reaching for the salt shaker. She laughed that her taste buds had learned new tricks after 80, and she no longer missed the extra salt at all. Whether these habits were the whole reason for her peaceful nights, I cannot say. But I noticed she rarely complained about swollen ankles or restless sleep. Throughout my life, I also observed something that had nothing to do with food or movement. The people who seemed to age with the greatest grace almost always had someone waiting to hear from them the next day. They had a friend to call, a neighbor to visit, grandchildren to encourage, or a small volunteer job that reminded them they still mattered. I often wondered why this made such a difference. Some studies suggest that long-term stress and loneliness may affect many parts of our health, including sleep quality, while researchers continue learning more about those connections. That certainly matched what I had seen with my own eyes. After my husband passed away, there were evenings when my house felt painfully quiet. Those were often the nights when sleep seemed the most fragile. Years later, when I began reading stories to children at our local library once a week and writing letters to old friends, I noticed that my evenings became calmer in a way I never expected. My body seemed to relax when my heart felt useful again. That realization prepared me for the four gentle habits that eventually became part of my own daily routine, and together they slowly changed the rhythm of both my nights and my mornings, without making me feel that I was fighting against my own age. When friends ask me what finally made the greatest difference, they are often surprised because my answer is never a miracle and never a complicated plan. It became a handful of gentle habits that slowly fit into my ordinary days, until they felt as natural as making my morning tea. I never expected changes overnight, and perhaps that helped me stay patient. The first habit was spending a few minutes every evening doing simple pelvic floor exercises. I learned them from a physical therapist during a community wellness class, and I practiced them quietly while sitting in my favorite chair. They took very little time, and over the months they became part of my evening without feeling like another chore. The second habit was paying closer attention to my evening meals. I did not stop enjoying food, but I gradually chose meals with less salt later in the day. Fresh vegetables, homemade soups, herbs, and simple home cooking began replacing many of the packaged foods that had slowly found their way into my kitchen over the years. I noticed that my rings and shoes often felt less tight by bedtime, and that alone encouraged me to keep going. Every morning, I also adopted a tiny routine that looked almost too simple to matter. While holding the kitchen counter, I slowly rose onto my toes and gently lowered my heels again several times. At first, I smiled because it seemed almost childish, yet after several weeks, my legs felt lighter as I moved around the house. Whether it was improving my circulation or simply encouraging me to start each day with movement, I cannot say for certain, but I enjoyed how it made me feel. The habit that surprised me the most came about an hour and a half before bedtime. I would sit comfortably on my sofa and rest my legs on a few firm pillows, so that my feet were a little higher than my heart for about 20 minutes while I listened to gentle music or read a book. Some researchers suggest that this position may help the body redistribute fluid before sleep for certain older adults. Although it is not appropriate for everyone, and anyone with medical conditions should ask their healthcare professional what is best for them. For me, it became a peaceful ritual rather than a treatment. Little by little, my nights became calmer. I was waking less often, my mornings felt brighter, and perhaps most importantly, I stopped feeling as though my body was working against me. Yet, as grateful as I was for those physical changes, I eventually realized that the greatest lesson had nothing to do with my legs or my sleep. It had everything to do with my heart, and that is the story I want to leave you with. When I think back to the frightened woman I was all those years ago, I wish I could sit beside her for just a few minutes. I would take her hand and tell her not to be so afraid of every restless night. I would tell her that the body is not always trying to make life harder. Sometimes it is simply asking us to pay closer attention. I would remind her that growing older does not mean giving up curiosity. In fact, I believe curiosity has been one of the greatest gifts of my long life. Every question I dared to ask opened another small door, and behind those doors I found hope instead of despair. My nights became quieter, not because I discovered a miracle, but because I slowly learned to respect what my body was trying to tell me. I also learned that peaceful sleep begins long before we climb into bed. It begins with gentle movement during the day, with simple meals prepared with care, with patient habits repeated without expecting instant results, and with a heart that still believes tomorrow is worth waking up for. After my husband passed away, there was a time when I wondered whether anyone truly needed me anymore. Those were some of the hardest years of my life. Everything changed when my youngest granddaughter asked me to help her learn to sew. That one small request reminded me that I still had something valuable to give. From there, I began visiting an elderly neighbor who rarely had company, baking an extra loaf of bread for a widow down the street, writing letters to old friends, and reading stories to children at our community library. Looking back, I sometimes think those moments healed something inside me that no medicine ever could. Researchers continue studying how purpose, social connection, and emotional well-being influence healthy aging, but I did not need a scientific paper to know how different I felt when I had someone to encourage. If you remember only one thing from my story, let it be this: do not lose faith in your ability to make small changes. Your body deserves kindness, your heart deserves purpose, and your life still has meaning no matter how many birthdays you have celebrated. Please speak openly with your healthcare professional about any new or persistent nighttime symptoms. Keep learning, stay patient with yourself, and never be ashamed to ask for help when you need it. And whenever you have the strength, offer that same kindness to someone else. I still wake each morning grateful for another sunrise, and I hope we can continue sharing these simple lessons together. If my story brought you comfort today, I would be honored if you subscribe to this channel so we can keep discovering gentle, practical ideas for healthy and meaningful aging together.